The bell of St. Crispin's had been ringing since before dawn, and its sound was not comfort. It moved through the cold stone of the steps like a hand pressing down, rhythmic and indifferent, and Cecily Morrow had been sitting beneath it long enough that she could no longer feel the distinction between the cold of the air and the cold of the stone beneath her. The satchel was in her lap. Her fingers had not left it in 3 hours. She was aware of how she looked. She had no illusions about that. Her gown, once a respectable dove gray, had acquired at its hem the particular color of Rhodes, walked in autumn, and her Spencer jacket was doing the work of a coat it had never been designed to perform. The gloves on her hands were her good ones, and she had put them on this morning with a deliberateness that was almost a statement, though there was no one present to receive it. The left thumb had been mended twice. She kept that hand on top. The churchyard was beginning to fill. Carriages arrived at intervals along the lane, their wheels crackling over the frosted gravel, and the people who descended from them were the kind of people who did not look at church steps. They looked at each other, at the quality of each other's horses, at the cut of each other's coats. The steps were below the register of their attention, and so Cecily was below it also. She did not resent this. She had stopped resenting it some weeks ago, when resentment began to feel like a luxury she could not afford to maintain. What she felt instead was a very specific, very contained determination that she had located somewhere in the region of her sternum and was tending with great care, the way one tends a small fire in wet weather. The satchel weighed almost nothing. That was the strangest part of it. The thing that had cost her father his reputation, his health, and in the end his life, weighed less than a day's bread. She had tested this once early on, setting it on the kitchen scale, out of some impulse toward honesty about what she was carrying, and the counterweight required had been negligible. A carriage larger than the others turned into the lane. Its horses were dark bays matched, and the coachman on the box handled them with the casual authority of a man who has been handling very good horses for a very long time. The carriage stopped at the gate, and the man who descended from it was tall enough that he had to mind the doorframe, and he minded it without thinking, which told her the height was not recent but habitual. He was dressed in dark navy, his cravat white and simply tied. He wore no jewelry. His boots were immaculate in a way that suggested he had not arrived from a great distance this morning, which meant he was staying somewhere nearby, which meant his business with St. Crispin's was not a passing errand. He paused at the gate and read the churchyard in a single glance, the way men of his kind often did, a glance that categorized and classified and moved on. Then his eyes came to the steps. They stopped on her. Not with contempt. Not with the charitable calculation that sometimes preceded the dropping of a coin. With something else which he could not immediately name, and which lasted 2 seconds longer than courtesy required. And then he looked away and walked through the gate, and his boots came up the path toward the door, and for one moment she felt the quality of his attention passing over her like a change in the air. The way the air changes a half-second before the bell rings again. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that the thing she had felt had a name either. But it was the beginning of something, and the bell of St. Crispin's went on ringing, and she held the satchel a little closer. Her father had been, by all accounts, that mattered to him. A careful man. Robert Morrow had spent 31 years as a solicitor in the market town of Alderwick, and he had earned his reputation the slow way, one transaction at a time. Until his name meant a thing men relied upon in the same way they relied upon certain weights and measures, because the reliability had been demonstrated over sufficient time and found consistent. He was not a wealthy man. The cottage on the south lane of Alderwick was modest, even by Alderwick's modest standards, and Cecily had grown up in it, understanding that its value was in its constancy rather than its comfort, that the papers her father kept in his locked drawer were more important than the furnishings around them, and that a man who does his work honestly will have one debt? What at the end? At least that to show. He had not counted on Sir Edmund Crewe. Sir Edmund had come to Alderwick 4 years before Robert Morrow's death, purchased the largest house in the district with money that seemed ample enough and comfortable enough not to require inquiry, and proceeded to acquire by one means and another a great deal of land he had not originally owned. The means and another were the part that had eventually drawn his attention, in the way that a man of 30 years' professional attention will sometimes be drawn to the smell of an instrument without being able to say immediately what is wrong with it. A conveyance of land from the estate of old Mr. Bertie, Vane to Sir Edmund's holding, had passed through Robert's office in the course of a routine title search, and the deed had smelled wrong to him with the particular instinct of a man who has handled thousands of deeds, who knows the handwriting of the clerks who work in the county offices, who knows which witnesses sign instruments in which districts, and who knows, in the present case, that old Mr. Verm? Vane had been confined to his bed with a lung complaint in September, because Robert had attended him himself to draft a codicil to the old man's will at the bedside, and the date on the conveyance deed was the 22nd of September, and Robert had sat at Vane's bedside on the 21st. He had spent 8 months gathering what could be gathered. The affidavit he had drafted was meticulous, cross-referenced, annotated in his small, even hand, its margins filled with the identifying marks of a man who has learned that accuracy is its own argument. It was witnessed by 2 men he trusted, the schoolmaster Thomas Petty and a retired clerk named Aldous Bright, both of whom had come to her father's parlor on a Tuesday evening in October, and signed and sealed the instrument in the lamplight while Cecily had sat in the kitchen with a book she had not read a word of. He had died on the following Thursday. The lung complaint had been his, also, it turned out. He had known it was coming for some months, and he had worked against it with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything, and he had finished the affidavit 3 days before the finish came for him. He left it to Cecily with a note that said, "Only you know what this is, and what it must be used for. I am sorry I could not complete it myself. Keep it safe." She had kept it safe. She had kept it safe through the arrival of Sir Edmund's solicitor at the cottage door with papers asserting that the property had been in the Crewe holding all along, and her father had been a tenant, not an owner. A claim of such complete brazenness that it had taken her 3 days to understand it was not an error. She had kept it safe through the parish's polite disengagement from her situation, through the vicar's regretful inability to contest a legal instrument on her behalf. She had kept it safe through the removal of her father's furniture, by men with a cart, in a manner that was not unkind but was immovable. And she had taken the satchel and walked out of the cottage with it under her arm, and she had been walking, in one sense or another, ever since. She had come to St. Crispin's because the will of old Mr. Gann, Vane's cousin, was being read this morning, and that will contain, as she had been told by the schoolmaster's wife, a bequest to the parish that would require the attendance of the county magistrate and a solicitor from the quarter sessions. She had come because those were the men who needed to see what was in the satchel, and those were the men who would be inside the church this morning, and she had no other means of arriving in the same room with them. She could not appear at the magistrate's court uninvited. She could not present herself at the quarter sessions without a sponsor or an instrument that constituted standing. She could sit on the steps of a church where the right people happened to be assembled, and she could wait, and she could hope that she was given a moment. She had not anticipated that the steps would be quite this cold. That was the one thing she had not planned for. Inside the church it was warmer, by the precise degree that a stone building with candles and 40-odd bodies is warmer than the stone steps outside it, which was not very warm, but it was not the steps. Cecily had not expected to be inside at all. She had been preparing to wait until the assembly emerged, and to approach the magistrate at the door, which would have required a boldness she possessed, but could not be certain of performing correctly. The plan had changed when the churchwarden had appeared on the steps shortly after she sat down, and told her she could not wait there, that it was not suitable, and that she would need to move along. And the tall man in the navy coat had appeared at the door at the same moment, and said quietly, and without inflection, "Find her a place inside, Hoskins. There is one near the vestry." It had not been a suggestion. The churchwarden had heard it for what it was, and so had Cecily, and she had stood and followed the churchwarden inside, and she had not yet decided what to do with the fact of it. Hoskins had found her a place near the vestry. It was a narrow pew set perpendicular to the main body of the church, the kind that held 3 people in some discomfort or 1 person with room to breathe, and Cecily was alone in it. From it she could see most of the assembly. Could see the candles burning on the altar bracket and the frost still unmelted on the leaded glass of the high windows. Could see the way the light fell across the gathered company in its gradations from good velvet to serviceable serge. The man in the navy coat was seated 6 rows ahead. She could see the line of his shoulders, the back of his neck, the clean dark of his hair, against the white of his cravat. He did not look back at her. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who is attending to the business at hand and who is not thinking, at least visibly, about the fact of having done something that might be noticed. She noticed it. She held it in the same careful way she held the satchel. The will reading was conducted by a solicitor named Mr. Dewey. Pringle, who had a voice designed by nature for the reading of legal instruments, and a manner that suggested he was aware of this, and considered it sufficient reason for his existence in the world. Sir Edmund Crewe sat in the front row with the ease of a man who has arranged the world around himself to such an extent that its arrangements have begun to feel like law. His coat was a deep green. There was a pin in his cravat that caught the candlelight and threw it back. He sat with one leg slightly crossed and his large hands resting on his thighs, and he listened to the will being read with the expression of a man who already knows the contents and is attending as a courtesy. Lady Hargrove sat beside him, which told Cecily something about the nature of their alliance. Lady Hargrove was a tall woman with silver hair and a manner that operated like a very quiet mechanism, precise and effective. When the reading paused between clauses, she leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and said something in a murmur, and Cecily could not hear the words, but she saw Lady Hargrove's pale eyes travel across the vestry pew with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to an obstacle they have already assessed and found manageable. "The solicitor's mad daughter," Lady Hargrove said, and the woman beside her made a small sound of comprehension. And that was all. That was the full extent of the voicing. But it carried. Cecily kept her hands flat on the satchel and her back very straight, and looked at the candles on the altar bracket. The will continued for another quarter hour. There were bequests to nephews, to a godson in Suffolk, to the parish, for the repair of the churchyard wall. Mr. Pringle read each clause with equal gravity, as though the size of the bequest was irrelevant to the ceremony of its reading. Cecily listened to the clauses that concerned real property with the close attention she had developed in the months since her father's death, an attention that was automatic now, that categorized and noted without conscious instruction. She had learned more about conveyances in the past 6 months than she had imagined it possible for anyone to learn who was not a solicitor by training. Sir Edmund in the front row had the look of a man for whom this specific will held nothing of direct concern, which meant his presence this morning was social, which meant he was here to be seen in the appropriate company, to stand in the churchyard afterward with his hand on the right man's shoulders, to be woven into the fabric of a morning that any subsequent inquiry might cite as evidence of his ordinary standing in the district. She understood the strategy because her father had described it to her. Once, when explaining how a fraud of this kind required not only a false instrument, but an entire surrounding structure of ordinary appearances. She looked at his broad back in its deep green coat and thought about the note in the satchel. After the assembly dispersed for the brief interval between the reading and the churchyard processional, Cecily stood. She needed to move her feet, which had gone half numb from the cold stone of the pew's floor, and she needed to position herself closer to the door, where the magistrate would pass. She had perhaps 4 minutes. The church warden appeared at her elbow with the air of a man executing an instruction he had been given and did not personally endorse. "Miss," he said, "perhaps the satchel would be more comfortable in the vestry room, for safekeeping, until after the processional." She understood exactly who had asked him to suggest this, and she understood what would happen to the satchel in the vestry room, and she understood that Sir Edmund had noticed her in the vestry pew and had made a calculation and acted on it. "No," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any particular right to expect. "Thank you. It is not mine to yield, Hoskins." The churchwarden blinked at her. She did not look at the door. She did not know if anyone was at the door. She held the satchel with both hands and looked at Hoskins with the expression of a woman who has considered the matter and reached a conclusion that requires no further discussion. And after a moment Hoskins said, "Very well," and withdrew. When she did look at the door, the man in the navy coat was standing in the frame of it. He had been there long enough to have seen what had just passed. His face was composed. His eyes were on her, and in them was something that the candlelight would not let her read precisely, and then she looked away first, which she could not afterward explain entirely, except that the thing in his face was of a quality she needed to approach carefully. If you have ever watched someone refuse a thing that the world had decided should be taken from them, with no weapon but a level voice, and both hands holding what they came to hold, you will understand what it is the Earl of Wexmere carried out of that church and into the rest of the month that followed. He had come to St. Crispin's for a cousin's will, and had left with something else entirely. The inquest into the Alaric land conveyances was called for the second Tuesday of December. In the assembly room of the Alaric Magistrates' Court, by the county magistrate Sir Arthur Coles. Cecily had waited for some word of it. She had waited in the schoolmaster's wife's small room, where Mrs. Petty had made her welcome with a warmth that was entirely uncomplicated, and therefore very difficult to receive, without emotion, and she had held the satchel on her knees in the evenings, and tried to understand the sequence of events that had resulted in an inquest being called at all. She had made no application to the quarter sessions. She had spoken to no authority that might have precipitated it. She learned the answer on the Monday before the inquest, when a letter arrived in her name. The letter was brief, formal, and from the office of Messrs. Alderton and Carow of Gray's Inn. It said that if Miss Morrow intended to appear at the inquest with her father's documents, she might find that she was not entirely without allies in the room. Mrs. Petty recognized the name. The Earl of Wexmere's firm, she said, looking at the letter with the expression of a woman revising several things at once. Cecily read the letter 3 times. She put it inside the satchel with the affidavit and the forged deed and her father's annotated notes, and she sat in the small room in the evening while the fire burned low, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had spoken no word to had apparently sent a solicitor to London on her account. She did not allow herself to think about it for too long. That direction of thought had a warmth in it she had not budgeted for, and warmth of that particular kind was a thing she was not yet in a position to afford. On the Sunday before the inquest, the vicar's housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gale, who bore no particular ill will toward Cecily but who was a faithful transmitter of whatever she heard, stopped her after the morning service to say, with the careful manner of a person delivering unpleasant information for the recipient's own benefit, that people were saying things that Sir Edmund's solicitor had been speaking to people, and that the phrase she had heard most frequently in those conversations was the solicitor's mad daughter. Cecily thanked her, and walked the long way back to Mrs. Sir Petty's house, and went to her room and sat down on the bed, and was very still for approximately 10 minutes. She was not weeping. She was doing the thing she had learned to do when the weight of her situation pressed down with its full force, which was to find the place in her sternum where the determination lived, and to check that it was still there and still burning. It was smaller than she would have liked, and colder than she would have preferred, but it was there. The solicitor's mad daughter. She had heard the phrase 3 times now, in 3 different voices, in 3 different registers. Lady Hargrove's murmur in the church had carried the casual authority of a woman who does not need to raise her voice, because the world has always arranged itself to catch what she drops into it at a whisper. Sir Edmund's version at the inquest table, which she had not yet heard but would hear on Tuesday, would be the formal version, the one placed on record, the one that named her in front of witnesses. And Mrs. Gale's Sunday morning transmission was the 3rd kind, which was also perhaps the most exhausting, being the version that told her what the air of Alaric itself was breathing, that the phrase had settled into the ordinary conversation of people who had no particular investment in it, who would pass it along without malice, as one passes along any piece of information that seems to settle a question. She sat with that for a moment. She let it sit. Then she took the affidavit out of the satchel and read it through again, all of it, every page, every notation in her father's small, even hand. And when she was done, she put it back and held the satchel, and thought about a man who had died believing that what he had put in writing was true, and that the truth, kept safe and delivered to the right hands, would eventually do its work. She thought about his note. You know what this is, and what it knows to be used for. Keep it safe. Tuesday morning, she put on her gray gown and her good gloves and her Spencer jacket, and she went to the assembly room of the Alaric Magistrates' Court, and she put the satchel on the table in front of her, and she waited. Sir Edmund's solicitor was a man named Whitmore, who had the look of someone who had made a comfortable living being efficient in the cause of inconvenient things. He arrived with a packet of papers and a counter-affidavit that he presented to Sir Arthur Coles with the confident manner of a man producing a winning hand. The counter-affidavit asserted that her father had been, in the final months of his life, of unsound understanding, subject to delusions and lapses of judgment, and that his professional records from that period were accordingly unreliable. It cited 2 letters from a physician and a statement from a neighbor who had allegedly observed Robert speaking to himself in the garden. Sir Edmund sat at the head of the table and allowed a pause to settle after the counter-affidavit was placed before Sir Arthur, a calculated pause in which the assembled witnesses might be invited to consider the matter already concluded. Then he said, in the middle of that pause, "One must have compassion for the solicitor's mad daughter, of course. Grief distorts even the best-ordered minds." The room received this with the quiet compliance of rooms that have been arranged to receive such things. Cecily sat with her hands flat on the table and did not speak. She kept her back straight, and her face composed, and let the silence have its moment, because it was not the moment for anything else. Then the door of the assembly room opened. The Earl of Wexmere walked in, and behind him came an elderly man of perhaps 70, lean and upright, with a watchful face that held the particular quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time, and has finally decided to set it down in the correct place. This man was Aldous Bright, the retired clerk who had witnessed the affidavit, and then, in the weeks following Robert's death, been persuaded by a combination of Crewe's solicitor's letters and his own considerable fear to remove himself to a cousin's house in Shropshire and remain there, silently until the matter should resolve itself one way or the other. He had received, 3 days ago, a visit from a representative of Messrs. Alderton and Carow of Gray's Inn. He had come back to Alaric. It was the look of a man coming back. The Earl of Wexmere did not take a seat immediately. He stood at the door for a moment, in the manner of a man who understands that his arrival has changed the weight of the room, and is giving the room a moment to adjust to the new distribution. His eyes found Sir Edmund first, and he let Sir Edmund see that they had. Then he looked at Cecily, and his gaze was not expressionless. She recognized it, the quality of it, from the doorway of St. Crispin's and from the steps before that, and she felt the warmth she had not budgeted for arriving in her chest without her permission. He placed 2 documents before Sir Arthur and spoke briefly, and with the directness of a man who has decided what needs to be said and intends to say it, and nothing else. The first document was Bright's statement. The second was a registration record, revealing that the instrument in the Crewe title chain had been filed before the land it purported to convey had been released from entail. It could not, therefore, have been legally executed on the date it bears, he said. The room was very quiet. Sir Edmund's face was doing something complicated beneath the surface of his certainty. Lady Hargrove's fan had stilled in her hands. Whitmore, the solicitor, looked at his papers with the expression of a man recalculating. "Miss Morrow," Sir Arthur said, "I believe you have documents of your own." She opened the satchel. Her hands were steady. She had not known, before this moment, whether they would be, and they were, and she was grateful for it in the specific, unperformed way one is grateful for a thing one needed and found present. The brass clasp was cold. The leather was the particular worn smooth of something handled daily for months. She had opened this satchel on the kitchen scale and on the bed in the small room and on her lap on the stone steps, and in the dark after Mrs. Gale's visit, when she had needed to confirm the papers were still there, and still real. She knew the interior of it without looking. She drew out the affidavit first, her father's annotated notes, second, the witness deed copy, third. and laid them on the table in the order he had numbered them, because he had numbered them, because he was a careful man who had understood that the person who came after him might need a clear sequence to follow. "This is my father's affidavit," she said, "dated the 15th of October, witnessed by Thomas Petty and Bright. It sets out the chain of instruments by which he had obtained the Alderwick conveyances, the discrepancies in their execution, and the names of the parties present or represented at each stage." She did not look at Sir Edmund. "My father was not a man of unsound understanding. He was a careful man who found a careful lie, and he documented it carefully, and he died before the world was ready to hear him." She placed her hands flat on the table again and was quiet. The Earl of Wexmere looked at Sir Edmund. He looked at the papers with the expression of a man watching a wall he had believed to be solid develop, slowly and irrevocably, a crack that no amount of confidence could persuade back into stillness. "This woman," the Earl of Wexmere said, and he said it with the weight of a man who has chosen his words with precision and intends every syllable of them to be received, "is the only honest witness in this room." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a rearrangement of what has been settled. Sir Arthur called for the instruments to be examined, and the examination took 2 hours. Sir Edmund sat at the head of the table, with diminishing ease and increasing stillness. Lady Hargrove excused herself before the first hour was complete, and the sound of her departure was audible to everyone, and acknowledged by no one. Bright gave his statement in a voice that was uncertain at first, and then, as it found the solid ground of what he knew to be true, and had known all along, entirely steady. He did not look at Sir Edmund while he spoke. He looked at the table in front of him, and at Sir Arthur, and once at Cecily briefly, with the expression of a man who recognizes the face of someone else who has been carrying something. Sir Arthur said, at the end of the second hour, that the record would be amended, and that several additional inquiries would follow. Sir Edmund's solicitor said that further examination might reveal additional nuance, and Sir Arthur said briefly that it would not. The solicitor gathered his papers. Sir Edmund rose from the head of the table and left the room with the last of his confidence on his face, which was the only thing he had left to carry, and the door closed behind him. Cecily sat very still for a moment. She breathed. After, the room sorted itself in the way of rooms when the immediate business has been completed, and the social arrangement must reassert itself around a new fact. Several people left quickly. Several remained, and talked in low voices. The magistrate's clerk was writing. The Earl of Wexmere stood near the window that looked onto the Alderwick Market Square. He had not left. She thought about that. The fact that he had not left, and she thought about the letter from Gray's Inn, and the look in the doorway of the church, and then she crossed the room to him. "The firm of Alderton and Carow," she said. "My father's firm," he said. "I retained the name when I inherited. Sentimental, I am told. You had your solicitor find Bright." "My solicitor's inquiry found him." "I had my solicitor make inquiries." A pause. "The distinction is technical." She looked at him. The winter light from the window was flat and gray and honest, and it showed her his face without the candlelight softening. He was older than she had initially taken him for, or perhaps not older, but more considered, the way men look when they have weighed something for a long time. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The market square outside held its sparse afternoon traffic, a cart moving slowly through, a woman with a basket, 2 boys running. "I had a brother," he said, "who signed a document. He should not have signed, who was pressed to sign it by a man whose methods I recognize now more clearly than I did then. Geoffrey lived in the consequence of that signing for the remainder of his short life. And I did not investigate soon enough, and I told myself it was no business of mine, and by the time I understood the truth of what had happened to him, Geoffrey was dead." His jaw was quiet, the set of it familiar to her now. "I did not intend to tell that story to myself a second time." She said nothing for a moment. In his breast pocket, the edge of a miniature was visible, its ivory corners worn smooth. "I am sorry about Geoffrey," she said. He looked at her, and it was the same look she had felt on the church steps. The length of it exceeding courtesy, And this time she did not look away, and this time neither did he. The week before, the conveyances were formally restored to the Morrow record. He called at Mrs. Petty's house with a formality that the schoolmaster found slightly overwhelming and Mrs. Petty found entirely comprehensible. He was shown into the small front parlor, and Mrs. Petty arranged herself in the next room with the door not entirely closed, and he told Cecily in the plain level sentences that were his native register that the cottage would be restored and that certain instruments remained but would be resolved, and that in the meantime she should apply to Messrs. Sam Alderton and Carow for whatever was needed. He stood to leave. She stood also. "I am going to ask you something that I have no right to ask," she said, before she had quite decided to say it. He was very still. "I should like to know," she said, "whether any part of this has been charity." The question came from a place she had tended carefully, the place that knew the world's charity for what it often was, which was another form of management, a way of making a situation manageable for the people who were uncomfortable with its existence. She needed to know if that was what had been happening, if the documents at the inquest and the solicitor's letter, and the seat inside the church, were the gestures of a man who found her situation inconvenient and wished to resolve it efficiently. He looked at her for a long time. Something arrived in his face with some difficulty, as though it had been kept at a considerable distance and was being admitted only now. "No," he said. "No part of it." She nodded, once precisely, and he left, and she stood in the small parlor for a long time afterward, with her hands very quiet at her sides and the fire making its small domestic sound in the grate. They were married in February, on a Thursday, in the same St. Crispin's whose steps had been, in a previous season, the full extent of her prospect. The vicar who performed the ceremony did so with a slightly increased warmth that she attributed to the improved situation, and chose not to hold against him. Mrs. Petty cried at the back. Bright sat in the third row, upright and clear-eyed. The schoolmaster blew his nose 3 times. Cecily wore a gown that was not gray. It was a pale cream with a narrow border of green at the hem, and it fit her as though it had been made for her, because it had been, and she had stood very still during the fitting at the modistes, and tried not to feel that the fittings were permanent, a word she had not allowed herself to use about anything for some months. The dress was permanent, the church was permanent, the man standing beside her at the altar was permanent, and when she understood that, truly understood it, the breath went out of her for a moment and had to be recovered. He noticed. She saw him notice the slight turn of his head, the attention. "All is well," she said quietly, for his ears only. "I know," he said. And the quality of it, the certainty without demand, the simple level fact of it, was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a long time. The satchel was on the desk in the study of Wexmere House when they returned from the church. He had placed it there himself, she discovered, in the days before the ceremony, and she found it when she came into the study to look at the room she had not yet seen, which had floor-to-ceiling shelves and a fire already laid, and a window looking onto the east garden, where February snow had settled overnight. Still and undisturbed in the early morning light. On the desk, the satchel sat open. Its clasp lay unlatched. The papers were gone, restored to the proper record, and filed in the magistrate's chambers. What remained inside was her father's note, which she had kept, which she had read so many times, she no longer needed to unfold it to see it. She stood at the window. The bare branches of the elm at the garden's edge held the gray of the sky in their fingers. "Cecily," he said. She had not heard him come in. She turned, and he was in the doorway, his navy coat still on, as though he had come in from somewhere outside, and not yet removed it, and the light from the window found the line of his jaw, and the small scar at his left cheek. She had not heard him say her name before. He said it carefully, as though he had been practicing the weight it required. "Come in, then," she said. He came in. He crossed the study and stood beside her at the window, near enough that the warmth of him was perceptible, and they looked at the east garden together, at the snow lying still, at the elm, at the distance. Your father was right, he said after a while. About the instruments, about the chain of evidence. All of it. I know, she said. He was always right. He was simply not alive for long enough. He said nothing. She felt his hand move, the edge of it finding the edge of hers at their sides, and he was not a man who did things carelessly or without intention, and she did not move her hand away. He kept good records, she said. Her voice was very steady. He taught me that. A thing documented correctly cannot be entirely lost. It can be buried and ignored and contradicted by men with more authority than conscience, but it cannot be lost entirely. It is still there. It waits. The fire in the grate made its small domestic sound. Outside the window, the elm held its bare branches against the gray. The satchel sat on the desk behind them, open, empty, its work finally done, its brass lock never to be turned again. If you have stayed with Cecily until this last morning and understood what she carried and what it cost her to carry it, leave a word in the quiet of wherever you are watching from. There are more such mornings ahead. The room was good, she decided. The light was honest, and the shelves were full of books, and the window looked onto a garden that was, in the technical sense of the word, hers. She had not had a garden in some months. She had not had a room with a desk in it or a fire already laid or a man standing beside her who had said no part of it and meant it. The elm in the garden would be green in April. She thought she would like to see that.